So first of all, thank you all very much for being here. This is a very big passion of mine, engaging parents around children. Because what people need to realize at the outset is that you as parents are the greatest protective feature for your children against any risk they face in the world ever. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is you are absolutely critical to their optimal development. Children need to be safe in order to develop properly, but children also need parents who develop them. And the one thing we're really struggling with at the moment is getting parents to participate in the parenting of their children. There's an enormous amount of outsourcing of parenting, whether that be to schools or pairs or whoever. And I can tell you the single greatest thing that will ensure your child's protection and development is you. Okay, so that's the first thing. All right, so just a brief background. I grew up in the south of Joburg, child protection specialist, Master of Sciences in Child Health. I'm a boxing and fitness instructor, I'm a chef, I'm a musician, and I'm proud of my city. Now, the reason I introduce myself like this is my public self. So you will see if you look me up online, this is what you'll find. I also have a private self, which I don't put online. And that's something we'll talk about at the end of the presentation, because I know parents love to do what we call sharenting. So sharenting is posting your children all over the internet, kind of for posterity, not knowing what people are doing and how they're interacting with your children. So you have to be very, very clear what it is that you are putting up in terms of yourself, and you have to start teaching your children from day one what they should be sharing and what they shouldn't. Because when I conclude this presentation, you'll see that the online world is actually currently far more dangerous than the real world, okay, for children's development. So the first thing is in terms of meaning and motivation. So to be a parent is associated with an enormous amount of inherent meaning. People have children for very specific reasons. So we have children who are planned and children who are wanted, and planned, wanted children have the best start in life. Unplanned, unwanted children have the worst start in life. So for example, my master's research is on the missing child murders of the city of Joburg. So there's an onslaught on children where we have unplanned, unwanted pregnancies, because we talk about children in this context of my research as being children whose births are not celebrated and their deaths are not mourned. So if you think about that as a concept, the first thing young people need to understand is you need to plan your children. And the well-being of children actually starts in the mind of the parent prior to conception. So what that means is you think about your child in your mind before you conceive your child in the world. And the reason for that is you make space. You make space in your relationship, you make space in your finances, you make space in your home, you make space within the rest of your life for that child being born. And then sometimes the child that is born is not the child that you pictured, but you become attached to the child that you have, and you love the child you have. Now, attachment in those first 2 years is one of the fundamental cornerstones of children's personality development. We call it personality organization. And children's personalities are organized based on two primary functions. The first function is the maternal function. So you will all know, based on just the demographic of the audience, look at how many men there are as opposed to women in the audience, and that tells you about the maternal function. And a lot of care has become maternalized. So in the first year of life, you will see children grow, they learn to walk, they're learning to talk, and the mother plays the primary role in the first year of life through a concept we call holding, and it's literally physical holding. And what happens in that year of life is that mother reduces the child's anxiety, makes them feel safe, and safety is the cornerstone of the maternal function. They need to feel safe in the world, and the mother helps them do that. In the second year of life, the paternal function becomes very important. So that's the function of the father figure. Now, we have, like, for example, in the inner city where I work, we probably have an absentee father rate of somewhere in the vicinity of 70%. So we call it a dad deficit model. So the absence of a father is not a benign thing. Okay, it is a harmful thing. Sometimes fathers being present is a bad thing because they're bad people and behave badly. But largely, when a father is there and participating, he performs an extremely important function. So the aim of the paternal function is to allow the child to enter the world and to learn their limits. Now, learning their limits is through things like roughhousing. So the simple explanation, particularly kind of in the Pretoria area and based on what's happening this afternoon, is an example of rugby. So the mother is saying, over my dead body will my boy play rugby. Dad's out buying rugby boots. Okay, that's the difference between the two, and both are necessary because the mother makes the child feel safe. The father reduces the child's aggression because they learn their limits through the roughhousing. Okay, so those first 2 years of development are absolutely critical for children to develop the foundations of their brain, because what happens in the first 2 years is an exponential, what we call neural pruning. So any of you got little babies, right? So you look after your little baby, they've got a very big head, soft, squishy skull, and as a result, you hold the head and you protect it. How many of you have got teenagers? How many of you have woken up with a stranger in your house? Okay. So the brain is doing the same thing in puberty as it did in infancy. It's repatterning itself. It's a thing called myelination. So you get a chance, which is why I like working with adults. Who of you remember your first love? And if you're sitting with your wife, you can pretend it's her. So who of you remember losing your first love? Went home and made sad mixtapes, wrote dark poetry about the meaninglessness of your existence, sat on the bed watching sad movies while eating ice cream, etc. And that's what we call the emotional spark of adolescence. So what happens is that what you laid down in the infancy years gets tarred. So if you think about grading a road in infancy, the brain goes quiet from about 5 till puberty, and then the brain catches fire. Okay, and you have another chance to repattern the brain in adolescence, and it's a really, really important, critical development stage, and it's largely who I work with. Then after the first 2 years of life, children need to become socialized, and socialization occurs in places like this, you know, in the church, at the back, in preschools. Children need to learn how to be with other people, because if they don't, they end up with the kind of behaviors that the children I deal with largely end up with. We call them unlucky behaviors, because they're the behaviors that push people away from them. They're aggressive, they don't know how to share, they are depressed, withdrawn, they self-harm, etc., etc. And those behaviors become exponentially problematic in adolescence because of the massive growth spurt in puberty. The fastest anyone will ever age in their life is during puberty. Okay, it's the quickest aging in exponential terms in the whole of your lifespan. So please remember that when children are socialized, they need to be in the world. Social media is not social. Okay, it's in fact antisocial. And that thing you see in the warning that says PG, it means parental guidance, not parent gone. Okay, so you need to understand that within the context of all of what we're going to do now, our children are growing up in two distinct worlds. So why do children need to be safe? So I'm sure all of you have at some stage in your lives been exposed to Maslow's hierarchy. You know we've had to change this hierarchy, by the way. Underneath there is battery power and Wi-Fi, and then it's food and shelter and so on. You know. But the importance that you can see there is for children to feel safe. They need to be safe before they can learn to love and belong, and before they can become. Children become where they belong, because where you are is how you are reflected back to yourself, and the way you reflect it back to yourself is the behaviors you keep or you lose. And you must remember, this thing doesn't care about your children at all. Okay, it doesn't. In fact, your children are products to the machine. All right, so it's the stuff I spoke about, social ties, relationships, sense of community, which something like a church would give them. So here's where we come into the scary part of the talk. So that's sort of a background on behavior. Here is the challenge of safety. Now remember, these challenges exist in the world and online at the moment in almost equal measure. Okay, so children are no safer in the world than the online and vice versa. In fact, I think in my recent work, the children are more unsafe online than they are in the world, and I'll explain why. So what you must understand is that there are two things that we need to consider when we are looking at the safety of children. The first is we need to make sure there are no acts of omission. So in other words, that's deliberately neglectful. So in other words, parents not doing things. Simple things would be strapping a child into a car seat at 2 years old rather than putting them on the front seat with no seatbelt. I mean, that's an obvious one. But then there's acts of commission, things done to children. And in the context of what I was asked to do in this talk, it is particularly to keep children safe from predators who are known to them. So in order for child sexual abuse to occur, there are 4 things that need to be present. First is the motivation of the person to abuse the child. And please understand what I'm about to say clearly. Their motivation is sex. You have to understand that, because people come with very complicated stories. That person was once a victim themselves. The minute you choose to victimize somebody, you lose the right to your own victimhood. Okay, you give it up. So don't come to me and say, this is what happened to you, this is why I'm doing it. You know what harm it caused you, I'm not interested. Because if we have stories like that, what happens is the child has to have some kind of feeling sorry for the person who's harmed them because they were once victims. Not. They need to be held entirely responsible for their behavior because it's a choice. And the reason we know it's a choice is because of the second one. So the second one is the internal inhibitors. These people who abuse children know what they are doing is wrong. How do we know they know what they're doing is wrong? Well, they keep it a secret. And they make the child keep it a secret. And the power of abuse is the secret. So they know it's wrong, yet they choose to still behave in that way. And then the most important thing for you today is the third level. So the third level is what we call external inhibitors. These are the things in the world that stop people behaving badly. Now, on a very simplistic level, the moral development of people largely goes as follows. First level of moral development, you want to avoid punishment. Next level of moral development, you want some kind of reward. Next level of moral development, you want to be seen as a certain kind of person. Okay, and then you want to obey the laws if they are just, and so on. So what we need to be is we need to be the eye on our children, both as parents and as a community, because it is us who will keep them safe, because we are the external inhibitors that will not allow predatory people to enter the worlds of children. And if they do, we will hold them accountable. Every single adult survivor case I've ever dealt with in my life, when we go and speak to the people, for example, the Bob Hewitt case, the Wimbledon tennis case, when you go back and speak to people who played tennis at the time, they'll say, we knew he was dodgy. We knew there was something not right, but no one did anything. Okay, because, we don't want to make false allegations. You're not making false allegations. You are calling people out on their unprofessional behavior towards children that blurs boundaries and allows people to get access to children when they are career offenders. So what are career offenders? Career offenders are people who choose jobs that give them access to children, and they use those jobs and make a career of abusing children. Average amount of children abused, let me give you an example of a case I gave evidence in. There were 23 boys who were abused, so there was charges of sexual abuse, there was charges of attempted murder, there was a whole lot of other things. There were 23 boys, one offender, 398 charges. One person, he was 22 years old. Okay, so you must understand these people are prolific, and that's the thing that needs to be understood. So what happens is that they get through all of those, then they've had to have groomed you as the parent, and they've had to have groomed the people who employ them before they can groom the children. So people always say to me, oh, well, we're worried about our children being kidnapped, abducted, etc. It is a worry. But what percentage do you think of the children I see have the offenders used physical force and abduction to get them? It's not even 1%. The rest have been groomed by the offenders. And you need to understand what grooming is, because you want to be able to tell your children what to watch out for. You need to know what to watch out for as parents, and as a community you need to know what to watch out for. So my first piece of guidance to parents is that if there's someone who pays more attention to your child than you have a problem. Okay, you must be the primary attachment figure for your child, not somebody else. So The current case study I have is a case study of a man who got a job at a private boys' school. And he then abused a whole lot of boys. He's currently facing a whole lot of charges in court. And he was simply moved from one school to the next because they didn't do the HR process properly. Okay, so the human resources component of this is very important, because what happens is they say, well, we believe you're behaving a bit badly. They have a conversation with him. He resigns. They say they've got no authority over him, and he just moves somewhere else. Okay, so in the US, they have a program called hashtag moving the trash referring to the sex offenders who they move from school to school. And they've started a new program which is now called hashtag taking out the trash, where what we are wanting to do is say that if you are going to be this kind of person and behave in unprofessional ways or ways that meet your needs, not the children's needs, we are going to stop you working with children. Okay, you can go work somewhere else, you just can't work with children. And how do we do this? Well, the first thing is that we need to understand that people who work with children need to be accredited to work with children. People who work with children need to have a knowledge of child development, otherwise how are you working with children? They need to be checked against the criminal register. They need to be checked against the sex offender register. They need to be checked against the child protection register. And the reason for that is that they then know that we know that people who work with children sometimes want to abuse them. So we are right at the beginning saying we recognize people try to get into these positions because they want access to children. And as a result, we put them through the registers, so they say, yo, these people are on the ball, you know, they know that there are these things called career offenders. Okay, and everyone says, oh, but it's like such a terrible thing. I welcome it. I welcome the fact that people check me against the registers and want to know my qualifications, because you should ask. You know, particularly in unregulated things such as sport. All right, and then obviously you want proper reference checks. You don't want to have the reference check that the person has put on their CV, because that's the person who likes them and has often moved them around. You need to find somebody else in that system that's not the person that's on the reference check. So we're in a bit of a battle at the moment with the department around the child protection register and sex offender register, because we're fighting for it to be made accessible to all parents. Okay, because the current rules are you can only access those registers if you employ somebody in a position working with children. So in other words, you have to be in an employer relationship. But my argument is that if I bring my child to the pastor at the church, that person is working with my child, therefore I should be able to check them. If I take my child to music lessons, if I take my child to sports coaching, I'm paying that person to do something with my child, therefore I should have access. Okay, so we're currently in the process of trying to get that, and I've got a big HR company trying to help us as well. So what you must watch out for with the adults in the lives of your children is that they start with two things as the beginning of the grooming process. They create a set of favorites and they isolate the children. So in other words, I mean, how many of you actively work with children? Just by show of hands. Right. How many of you work with children you love? Like? Find mildly agreeable on a good day? Do not like? So what you have to recognize is that we never treat children the same. We always treat them professionally. And that's the difference. Okay, you cannot treat children the same. Children are not the same. And if you're treating children the same, you're doing something wrong. So you need to look at, do adults favor certain children, and do they create situations where they isolate the children? For example, your child's going to be the next Eben Itzebeth. I'm going to give him private lessons on a Sunday morning, which isolates him from everybody, and I'm going to come pick him up in my car and drive him to the rugby practice where it's just me and him. Okay? That is where the danger starts. Okay, for the parent, that's nice because, you know, this person has seen the talent in my child and as a result is going to, you know, bring out the best in my child. Then we have these programs where we teach children to say no. Now, these programs interest me a great deal. How many of you have your own children? How many of you actively encourage your children to say no to you? In fact, you override them saying no to you in many instances, particularly when you take your little toddler along who you're very proud of to go talk to mother-in-law mother-in-law says, kiss granny, hello, child has a look and says, I don't think so. And you say, you better kiss granny, because otherwise she's going to say, I've raised a disrespectful child, and she already doesn't like me because I've taken her darling son out the house and she doesn't believe I'm good enough to begin with. So we don't even give children the ability to practice saying no in safe context. And then what happens when they can't say no because they can't say no, they feel shame and guilt because you've told them they should say no, but they can't say no. And as a result, you disincentivize disclosure. So the most important thing is that children, if they feel uncomfortable, if they feel someone's doing things to them that are not right, they need to be able to tell you, irrespective of whether they could or could not say no, because largely they cannot say no. It's just the nature of how our society works. Okay, but that having been said, I want to work in a world and be in a world where children don't need to say no to adults because adults don't behave in inappropriate ways, or the adults who are around the child say no on behalf of the child before they get anywhere near the child. Okay, so my thing is, rather than more #MeToos, which is my generation, it's people where there was no language for sexual abuse. The only time we developed a language for sexual abuse in this country was when the Van Rooyen girls were kidnapped. And then literally it was the Satanists taking our children in those years, literally. And as a result, it wasn't polite society who was doing it, it was everybody. You know, it was pervasive. So my hashtag and the mission for my life is #ItEndsWithMe. In other words, the abuse of children stops with me because I know I have a language, children can come talk to me, there are resources, we will stop this. So this is where things become dangerous. So we move from the worrying, the of concern, the favoritism and the isolation, etc. Now we are in the world of danger. So the first level of danger associated with career offenders is the fact that they create what are called boundary violations. So a boundary is a professional boundary. So I'm going to give you a case that I dealt with, and this man he came from a smallish Western Cape town. He was the under-13 rugby coach, the Afrikaans teacher, the art teacher. He coached at the local club, went to the local gym. It was a smallish town. And he also was a pastor at the local church, and he ran the biggest youth cell group within that church. So he's a rugby coach at the school. So how many is the average, how many boys on average are there in a rugby squad? 22, with all your reserves and subs and all of that kind of thing. So there is a WhatsApp group to sort out practices and to communicate and so on. But very importantly, the children are on that WhatsApp group with a parent representative, with the coach. But what he does then is he goes to the slide above and he chooses 4 boys out of the 22 and he starts messaging them individually. Okay, firstly, how do you think he chooses the 4 boys? Everybody's, it's the vulnerable boy who doesn't have a dad, who's got problems at home. No, that's only half the story. The other half of the story is it's the elite children who want to be the next Springbok rugby player. So you mustn't misunderstand that it's these children who are vulnerable that are vulnerable. Children in elite positions, particularly in sport, are vulnerable because of a whole lot of what we call sanctuary social deviance in sport. So the first message he sends to all 4 boys separately, so remember, isolation, favoritism. He says to them, how are your legs after rugby? Is that a normal thing to ask? How many of you think it's not normal? How many of you think it's normal? The rest of you have absolutely no idea whatsoever. Eh? And that's the point. It's one of those things where you're not quite sure. Only 3 boys answer his message. Next message, do you still go to the Virgin Active? Now, that is not a school-based thing. That is in the community. So now starting to stray from the school into the community. 2 boys answer that message. The next message is, do you still use the sauna? So that message, I can just see by your facial expressions, by the way you're shaking your heads, and now suddenly you know that what he's doing is now no longer appropriate. The first 2 you weren't so sure, because maybe, with the leg question, maybe it was anti-Johnny Bravo day, don't miss leg day, maybe it was front row training day. There could have been reasons, or maybe the children were injured or whatever. But the problem was, he isolated them, created favorites, and and message them individually. That's where the problem started. And then he shifted the boundaries from professional to personal. So only one boy answers that message. What's the next message? Meet me there, I'll rub your legs for you. Okay. Now, in those 4 messages, he was convicted of grooming, obviously dismissed from the school, not able to do any of the youth pastor work anymore, not able to coach at the local club because he's now on the child protection register and the sex offender register because he's committed a sexual offense without touching a child. So you must understand there are no trappe van vergelyking in child abuse. Okay, it's about the betrayal of the child's relationship with the adult, and it's the shame that results from it that causes the damage. Okay. Once you get to this level, you are now beyond danger, you are now in trouble. So this is largely where I try and focus with the young people that I speak to. So these offenders use a thing called a taboo violation, and a taboo violation is they not only allow something that an adult wouldn't allow, like a parent or a pastor or a teacher. They not only allow it, they facilitate it, they often pay for it, they participate in it as well. Okay? And these are generally things that children of that age are not legally allowed to do, such as alcohol is number 1. Okay, so as you can see, I'm a white South African English-speaking male, so I have absolutely no culture whatsoever. And as a result, my rite of passage into adulthood when 21 was still a thing was how much I could drink without getting sick and falling over. You think about people going and watching sport. They drink before the game. They drink during the game. They drink more when they're winning. They drink more when they're losing. After the game, they drink because they won. They drink because they lost. Okay, so there's a level at which alcohol is a pervasive problem because it's the one thing that when you don't do it, people ask you what's wrong with you. Okay, it's the one weird thing, you know, like if people, you know, do other drugs and things, oh, that's not great, but if you don't drink, well, why not? And as a result, sport, for example, and alcohol are completely mixed with one another. So these guys will take the boys down to a rugby tour or a camp or whatever, and they will, as I say, not only allow them to drink, they will buy the drink and they will drink with them. What are the other things we see in taboo violations? Vaping has become massive. We had a swimming coach referred to me who told the young people that vaping was good for them because they're breathing in water, it's expanding their lung capacity, and they will be better swimmers as a result. Okay, now that is they're wanting to become too familiar with the children. That is not a professional thing to do. And the reason they want to become familiar could vary. It could be for sexual reasons. Sometimes it could just be for a simple reason like career promotion. For example, they want to be the coach that is liked so that you will pay them because their child is asking for that person to be the coach. But even if it is the case that their motive is not sexual, that person is allowing a window for a predator to get in because they are normalizing that behavior within that context, even if their intentions are not bad. So they have to be called out on that. The other one we have in big problems with at the moment is marijuana. And marijuana, because everybody has made CBD the cure from anything from a pimple on your toe to brain cancer, we have this marketing strategy where everyone takes marijuana. Let me tell any of you, marijuana, particularly THC, in young people, it breaks their brains. Okay, it is very, very bad for adolescent development. It breaks teenagers' brains. So all of these canna things you see all over, every time I see another canna store pop up, my heart sinks because I see the consequences of them. Generally, dumb, demotivated young people. Okay, because CBD and THC are completely different compounds, but no one tells anybody that, and as a result, everybody's taking THC, and what THC does is it coats a part of the, what's called the endocannabinoid system in the body, and it coats a part of the brain that is responsible for happiness. Okay, it removes the happiness molecule, which is called anandamide. Okay. What then happens is that there is a level at which they test children and they test the adults. So you can see in those messages that were sent in the WhatsApps, they start by relatively innocuous questions. But then one child says, why is this weirdo messaging me? He doesn't reply. Then he tests and tests and tests, and they push the boundaries further and further. Now, there are multiple things that go wrong with children who are sexually abused. But I just want to focus on the top one for the moment, because that's the one that worries me most. So it's a concept called eroticization or traumatic sexualization. And what happens in that process is, because a child is abused by an adult or an older person at a time when they are not supposed to be developing that element of their sexuality, their sexual development becomes distorted. And the primary distortion we see in the behavior is we see them reenacting the trauma. So what will happen is, for example, at the child abuse clinic where I worked, a third of the children who I saw had been abused more than once by more than one person on different occasions. Okay? In the children's home where I worked, 75% of the children had been abused more than once by more than one person on different occasions. So they'd been abused at home, they'd been abused in extended family care, they'd been abused in foster care, they'd been abused in the children's home, they'd been abused at school. Because what happens is they behave in ways that look sexual to adults, but in fact it's a trauma reenactment. And what happens is the adults perceive the behavior as being promiscuous, and then they target those children. And as a result, there is an enormous amount of ongoing sexual trauma, which then leads to some serious problems in children's personality development and leads to big later problems around how they see themselves and how they see other people in the world and how they experience sex and sexuality as a domain of development. It is devastating to children's development. So when we see children act out sexually, that doesn't mean that they've necessarily been sexually abused in our modern world. What can also have happened is that they are exposed. So, how many of you went to a school where you used to have Friday afternoon movies? None of you. So I grew up in the south of Joburg. I think they were trying to keep us off the streets. So we used to pay 50 cents and we used to go and watch a movie, and it was maybe John Wayne or Bruce Lee or whatever. The second we left that hall, we were all Bruce Lee and John Wayne and various characters. It's called Bandura's social learning theory. You cannot possibly believe that what children are seeing on screens does not impact on their behavior. Okay, it does. The idea that it doesn't is mythical to me. And you can actually go and look at the YouTube clip. It's called Bandura's Bobo. And Bandura was a social learning theorist, psychologist, and he took a Bobo doll, which is one of those blow-up dolls that have the sand at the bottom, and you punch it and it comes back, and you punch it, it comes back. And what they did is they got the adult to go into a room, the child watched through a one-way mirror, and the adult beats the life out of this Bobo doll. The second the child gets put in the room, the child does exactly the same to the Bobo, but more. Interestingly, in a playroom, you've got various corners. One of the corners in a playroom is what we call the aggression or the violence corner. So it has aggressive things in it, one of which is guns. Even if the adults didn't touch the gun, the children who had watched it were more likely to go to the aggressive corner and take the gun, even though the adult hadn't touched the gun. So you have to understand that these things are conditioning our children. It's no longer just about them being addicted. It's no longer just about the obsessive nature of it. It is operant conditioning. If you think back to Pavlov, ring a bell, feed a dog, ring a bell, feed a dog, ring a bell, feed a dog, read a bell, don't feed a dog, dog still salivates. That's what notifications are on your machine. But there's a second component, and the second component is in relation to how you interact with the machine. So, why are we too blind to see? Well, largely because of a river in Africa, denial. I can make bad dad jokes because I'm a grandfather now. So, the first is denial of fact. So if you go and read the report, it's a public report, they've taken out all the children's names, and it's worth reading because it traces how this man got access to children and how that boy ended up taking his life. That was the inquiry. And in that case, it was an act of omission where the principal, and you'll read it in the report, it is not possible that this person I employed and I know who sat at my table with my children eating could possibly have done this. Anybody is capable of abusing children. And the problem is it's not the shady people that you warn your children against on the corner. It's the people that get access to children. They're the dangerous ones. It's like the people sitting here. Okay, because they get access to children. All right. The second is denial of impact. As I've said to you, there's no trappe van vergelijking of child abuse. All sexual abuse is damaging because it damages the relationship with the child and it damages their sexual development. And then finally, denial of responsibility. And that the child came on to me. They wanted it. She was wearing a short skirt. It's all that rape myth stuff, okay, where you blame the victim. And sometimes we end up victim blaming, particularly in the children from the previous slide who are traumatically sexualized. Okay, because their behavior is interpreted as sexual when it is in fact traumatic. And then we end up, between us and the accused people, we end up with what we call cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance is difficult to deal with. It's the noise in your head. And it's a noise in your head where you can't reconcile that this person that you know and worked with and employed, etc., can possibly harm people. It just doesn't make sense to you. But at the same time, you know that children don't lie about this kind of thing. So now how do you hold those two competing things in your mind simultaneously? And what that tends to do is paralyze people. It makes them not do stuff because they don't know what to do. And everybody I speak to, but I didn't have evidence. I'm like, you're not CSI. You are requesting an investigation by the authorities into this. You're not making an accusation against somebody. Okay, you're requesting an investigation. And then the cognitive distortions are largely by the offenders, where they basically will say things to you like, oh, but I really love the child. The child said I could have sex with them. The child's 5, et cetera, et cetera. So they create these kind of distortions and dissonances in their mind. So in conclusion, I want to mention another study that was done, and I do want you to go out and watch it. It's a study called the still face experiment. So what happens is a mother gets put in a room with her baby, and the baby's in a high chair, and the parent is interacting with the baby, and kuchi, and doing all the great things that parents do, like vocalizing and eye contact and hand gestures and great facial expressions, mirroring the child through the mirror neurons and all these wonderful things that bonding and attachment is all about. Then they say to the mother, turn your face off. So in other words, completely deadpan. Do not react to anything your child says or does. Within 40 seconds, that child is hysterical, trying to activate the mother. So a lot of the behavior I see is an attempt for the children to activate their parents. So I will get a boy who comes, he's referred to me because he's got himself into big trouble. He's taken gin to school in his water bottle, doing sexual things with girls. His parents told him to shut his mouth, so he glued his lips together with super glue, put a bag on his head and jumped in the pool. It's really hectic stuff. I'm sitting in the room with him and his father talking about what's going on. The father's looking at the notifications on his watch, on his Tamagotchi. We call these things Tamagotchis now, because the stupid animal is keeping alive is you. So the problem with the notifications is that if you look down while you're talking to your child, your facial expression is in relation to what's on the screen, not coherent with what the child is saying to you. I have children telling me, please tell my mother to put her phone down when I'm talking to her. That should never be. Okay? And parents, but I'm working. I'm like, well, don't. Create, post-COVID, we're all in a problem. Everybody's accessible. I'm not. People say to me, I can't get hold of you. I say, I know. It's on purpose you can't get hold of me. Okay, because I do things like this where I actually sit with people and I need to be present with them. So what do you need to watch out for online with your children? Number one, they all lie about their age. And the parents pay no attention to it whatsoever. In fact, to the extent where parents give their children their phones on their profiles as adults for the children to play on. Okay, which means there's no age restrictions. So the most important thing is you need to stick to age restrictions, okay? And you need to go and look at what those age restrictions are. You just Google it. There's a thing called common sense parenting you can go on, where parents have set age restrictions rather than the developers. Because the developers want to sell this thing. They're not going to give you a correct age. They want to get the children when they are young and impressionable, okay? Then you need to be very aware of what friends and followers are, because friends and followers online are currency for children. Because everybody wants to be an influencer or a kidfluencer or whatever it is they want to be, and everyone's doing their sharenting stuff, and everybody wants to be seen and liked and whatever. And I mean, I've got probably about 5,000 followers or whatever. If I had 5,000 people following me around in an average day, I'd actually be quite afraid, you know? But online, the opposite is true. So people that you would ordinarily not let into your house, you let into your house via this door and this window, literally, and I'm not being dramatic, to your child's soul, okay? Because these people, once they get in, they start doing all of this stuff, the online dating, okay? Online dating, I had a boy the other day, he had never met the girl that he was dating online. Go back to your first love. She broke up with him, he tried to kill himself. Okay, he's 13, he never met her. Okay, so these things are very powerful. Secondly, exposure to the pornographic script. You should be very afraid of what children are seeing online. I see children who present to me who have looked at pornography online that is the equivalent of the crime scenes I investigate. Okay, it is not pornography like you buy at Loveland. It's pornography that is images of the sexual assault of children, for example, or violence, or death, or animals, or etc., etc. And they present to me, they look with the exact same symptoms as the children who are sexually abused. They present with that thing I call traumatic sexualization because they start reenacting what they've seen underneath a huge amount of shame and guilt. Okay? And then the final one is a thing that they are luring, particularly our young men. There are girls being lured into it as well, but particularly our young men, and particularly from very, very wealthy boys-only schools. So what happens is they go out fishing, they create an image of a 14-year-old girl from California in her bikini with her surfboard, and this boy now wants to date her, and they go looking because they look for what school they're at, they look at the fact that these are young people who come from prestigious backgrounds, and then they start saying, oh, I love you, and the dating. Then they start asking for images. First image, send me an image of yourself, what you're wearing now. Send me an image of yourself when you are playing rugby. Send me an image of yourself when you're playing water polo. Then send me a naked image. Then they send the naked image, and the message they get back is, now you have to do this list of things. So there's a list that they give them of things they need to do, sexual things, to send back to them. Otherwise, they're going to release that naked photo all over Instagram. Bearing in mind we're in the world of deep fake now at the moment, where people can make these images up even when they don't even exist and make you sound like you're the person who's in the video. But in these cases, what they do is they send the list, and then these boys need to do that list, otherwise they are going to release the photo. And to show they're serious, they send the photo to that person's 5 closest friends on Instagram. Then the one boy wrote back to the person and said to them, listen, you've been ugly to this friend of mine, please stop it. He says, okay, really? If you want to get involved now, you send me these things, otherwise I'm going to release your friend's photo. Why do they want the list of things rather than blackmailing them for money? Number one, children don't have money. Okay, they have to ask their parents for money. Number two, they put them up on pornography sites to sell as child pornography income for the rest of time. So, what security do you have at home? Who do you allow in? You need to apply exactly the same to their children's phones, and you need to know who they let in. Thank you.